I'm Amanda Chicago Lewis. I'm a journalist based in LA, and I've been covering legalization and the cannabis industry since 2013 for publications like Rolling Stone, Wired, GQ, and the New York Times. We're here today with Kat Packer, the first and so far only executive director of the Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation. Kat, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Amanda.
Let's start with a little context for those who might need it. California voters legalized medical cannabis in 1996. The state legislature passed a law allowing nonprofit marijuana collectives, not businesses, collectives, in 2003, and by 2006, there were hundreds of weed stores in LA. By 2010, there were 2,000 pot shops here, making LA the biggest and most important cannabis market in the world. But technically, none of these businesses were legal. Even after voters passed a ballot initiative legalizing adult use cannabis in 2016, the city of LA was going to have to figure out on its own what to do with these 2,000 illegal marijuana dispensaries. Enter Kat Packer. Kat Packer was a young activist from Ohio who had been working in LA with the influential organization, the Drug Policy Alliance, when she caught the eye of city officials and was appointed to run the city's very first Department of Cannabis Regulation in 2017. She's held that role for the past 3.5 years. Kat, do you agree that when you arrived on the job, cannabis in Los Angeles was a big old mess?
Yes, it was very much a mess in the city of Los Angeles. As you had previously described, both the state of California and the city of Los Angeles did not have a framework for regulation. And so both the state and the city of Los Angeles and other jurisdictions in the state of California had a big task on their hands after voters decided to legalize cannabis for adult use. I was tasked with building an agency, the Department of Cannabis Regulation, from scratch, transitioning some of those operators that you had mentioned previously, and also trying to bring on new businesses for the first time with hundreds of new regulations, both at the state and local level. And we were doing so simultaneously while attempting to acknowledge and address the harms of the drug war by way of establishing what has increasingly been referred to as social equity programs. And so over the course of the last 3.5 years, there have been lots of challenges and lots of lessons learned.
So all in all, Kat came on the job with just an easy, small, little task to take care of here. And as you were saying, the conversation around legalizing cannabis has turned in recent years to what we call equity or social equity, which could be described as a form of reparations for the racially disparate outcomes of the war on drugs. Los Angeles, among several other places, has attempted to implement what's called a social equity program. At the same time, arguments about how to devise a social equity program have stalled legalization efforts in, among other places, New York. So, Kat, what do you think we've learned in Los Angeles about the nature of such a program that could be useful to other places now?
I think there are many lessons learned that I and other regulators, those who are primarily tasked with developing and implementing these social equity programs, have learned over the last several years. And it's important to note that even the first equity program in the nation, which was started in Oakland, California, is all but just a few years old. And so there is, in some sense, relatively little data, but there are lots of lessons learned. And I think the biggest lesson is that we have to be proactive and intentional about our approach to equity. And really, we're behind the ball if we wait until adult use legalization to begin to have these conversations, because we not only have to make sure that we get the policy right, and that is critically important, but we also have to make sure we get the implementation of the policy right. And it's been the case here in the city of Los Angeles and in many of the other jurisdictions that have social equity programs across the country, that there is increasingly just not enough administrative support. There's not enough resources to get these programs off the ground. And so a lot of the times these markets will start before these critical programs are in place. And in communities, those who historically have been disproportionately impacted continue to get left behind. And so I think it starts with making sure that you have the right policy in place, and there are many different considerations that jurisdictions have to make when they're establishing social equity programs, from deciding who qualifies for social equity programs. Largely, social equity programs base their eligibility criteria based on harm indicators. So some of those harm indicators are if you are low income, if you have a prior California cannabis arrest or conviction, if you've lived in a community that's disproportionately impacted area, but there's no general consensus on what even just the eligibility criteria is. And then, and in order to reduce barriers to entry into the cannabis market, equity programs seek to devise several strategies and programs like fee assistance or financial assistance or priority processing of applications or education and technical support. But the reality is that all of these things should set the floor, not the ceiling, for what equity programs could and should mean. And we also have to think increasingly about how we ensure equity beyond licensing in the cannabis industry. That is a critical and important piece. It's also just important to make sure that we have automatic expungement, provisions for community reinvestment, where we're taking tax dollars from cannabis tax revenue and reinvesting it in the community, and then also just thinking comprehensively about the ways that harms continue to linger, in the ways that cannabis consumers are treated differently than other folks in society. All of those things, if not thought about intentionally and proactively, will continue to exist post-legalization.
Right. So, I want to emphasize that legalization is already very complicated, and that social equity programs are these ambitious social justice initiatives that, as Kat just highlighted, can be very troubled for a number of different reasons. I think timing, as Kat just said, right? Most places legalize medical use before recreational use, and we've seen in places a market set up under medical may be less likely to have a social equity program, and then all of the folks who are running that market get a first mover advantage that then is very difficult to undo once adult use and social equity comes to play. We've seen that in Los Angeles, we've seen that in Chicago and in Illinois more broadly. And then, of course, this question of what are the qualifications that someone needs to have to be a social equity applicant. Just as a small example, the census and crime data measure Latino folks differently. So it's very hard to align those two types of measurements to figure out who's been disproportionately impacted. So in 2019, allegations of corruption actually halted the social equity licensing process in Los Angeles. And a lot of the people who tried to get involved in the social equity process years ago are still throwing lots and lots of money at properties that they are supposed to have under control in order to get licenses. And meanwhile, they haven't been able to open their businesses yet. So, Kat, I've heard some people say that the attempt to implement an equity program in Los Angeles has completely backfired. Do you agree?
No, I don't think that it's backfired. I think that it's a work in progress. A lot of the times, regulators who are tasked with implementing these programs are asked to grade themselves on their effort, and I can say that we've made every effort under our own to try and see these programs and to see these businesses be successful, but it takes time, and we're in the process of implementing programming for the very first time that seeks to rectify decades and decades of harm. I think that through our experience thus far, as I mentioned previously, there are definitely lessons learned and things we wouldn't do again should we have the opportunity. For example, the city of Los Angeles initially required that applicants, social equity applicants, have property before they submitted their application, just to determine if they would be eligible to move forward in the application process. Although that is something that our office advocated against, ultimately, City Council did pass a policy that required applicants to hold on to property. And so we have a circumstance today where applicants have been paying for rent for over a year now during the application process. And for many of these businesses, it'll still be several months before they receive their licenses. I think these are the types of lessons that regulators have a responsibility to share with others who are seeking to develop new programs to move forward. But that's something that we don't have to and we won't replicate here in the city of Los Angeles. So the Department of Cannabis Regulation and my office recommended a series of comprehensive amendments to the Cannabis Procedures Ordinance in the city of Los Angeles in the summer of last year. And fortunately, every single one of those recommendations was adopted. And so now we no longer have a policy where we require folks to have a property up front. The next round of retail licenses that we make available, we will identify those applicants not by a first come, first served process, which was heavily criticized in the city of Los Angeles, but by a lottery. And we will identify those social equity applicants by lottery and then give those applicants up to a year to come back to the department with a property and with a full business application. These are some of the ways that we can take lessons learned and be proactive about using those lessons in how we move forward. Another thing that we recommended that was adopted by the City Council here in the city of Los Angeles was that we amended our policy so that only social equity applicants have access to new retail and new delivery licenses until January 1st of 2025. This is now being referred to as license exclusivity. And we've recognized, even just by looking at the benefits that our existing medical marijuana dispensaries have experienced by essentially having no competition in the market for the last several years, how beneficial that's been to our existing medical marijuana dispensaries, most of which have been owned predominantly by white men. And so by taking some of these lessons learned, I think that folks in the city of Los Angeles and folks who are participating in our program will over time begin to see the benefits associated with this program. But I acknowledge that it hasn't been the prettiest process or experience, but I wouldn't discount not only its intention, but the potential outcomes of the program as well. I also have to acknowledge that we're at a point in time in society where communities, and particularly communities of color, Black and brown folks, are very distrusting of government institutions. And so when this idea and concept of social equity comes along, many communities can be skeptical about what this means for them. And we have a responsibility as public servants to deliver on the promises of equity and of cannabis policy reform. There's a lot of talk out of various politicians about the harms of the war on drugs and about the need to rectify these things. But when it comes down to how we establish our budgets, how we actually write our laws, and the intention and effort that we put behind these programs, communities need to see that at work. And I know that there have been concerns about corruption generally in the cannabis industry and as it relates to social equity programs. And that's difficult to, their concerns are difficult to discount when Like in places like the city of Los Angeles, we've had council members who have been arrested by the FBI and have been under investigation for corruption. And so it makes my job, the job of regulators, even more difficult. But that means that we have to be increasingly thoughtful and intentional about how we engage with communities, keep stakeholders engaged in this process, but then also make a real commitment to follow through and know that it may not come in year 1, 2, or 3, and that doesn't mean that we walk away from the program altogether. It means that we double down, we collect data, we strategize about how we can improve these policies, and we stay committed until we reach the outcomes that we originally sought.
Yeah, Los Angeles has made a lot of mistakes and gone out on a limb, so other places don't have to. So it's a great example for other people and other states to understand what not to do. I'm curious, you talked about policy changes that happened last year in the cannabis program in Los Angeles, and I want to know, what role did the George Floyd protests in June of 2020 play in those changes? And I think more specifically, I'm wondering, as an activist turned bureaucrat, what advice do you have for people looking to affect change on a local level? So did you feel you had more leverage when you were outside of the room where it happens or inside of the room where it happens? And perhaps I should mention the third path here might be politician, right? Because you're not an elected official, you're an appointed bureaucrat. So is there a path that for young people or for people considering how to stay involved in the fight for racial justice might offer the most power and influence?
Yeah, I think that for me in particular, I was a drug policy reform advocate and activist with the Drug Policy Alliance prior to joining the city. And I often like to say that I'm an agitator turned regulator in this space. As it wasn't me who was in this position, in this role, I would still be heavily engaged and highly critical of what's going on in the city of Los Angeles. And I don't think that folks that are in these positions should be scared of criticism. I think we have to welcome it because I found that that's largely where progress is made, is when we can think critically about our policies and their impacts. And that's the whole idea behind this concept of these social equity programs, is to recognize the impact that past policies have had on communities. We can't be naive to think that our current or future policies won't have impacts as well. And I think that there's often an inside and an outside game that has to be engaged in order to see victories and to see successes. Folks who work in the advocacy space, particularly the policy advocacy space, will know that they may run a bill year after year after year before it finally gets passed. And then folks have to stay at the table to make sure that it's implemented properly. But in terms of the death of George Floyd and the protests for racial injustice that have happened throughout the United States, truth be told, my office, my team had been working on these amendments for months because we recognized that historically we had tried to do this piecemeal process to reform some of our policies, and sometimes we were unsuccessful in even just moving things piece by piece. But I think that and I went back to my team and I said, I don't necessarily know if City Council is going to be receptive to every single policy recommendation that we make, but let's try and approach it comprehensively. Let's try and look at the licensing program. Let's look at the social equity program. Let's try and find a way to make it more streamlined, to improve the processes and to strengthen different provisions of the social equity program. And then when all of the protests around the death of George Floyd happened, I think that allowed City Council to be more receptive to adopting the policies, but the policies themselves had to have been written ahead of time, but I definitely think that we were able to uh, essentially just leverage the moment that we were in. And I think that that moment hasn't gone away. We have to recognize that there is still an immediate and urgent need for cannabis policy reform at every single level of government. Harms continue to persist and continue to be disproportionately impactful to communities of color. Even in states that have legalized, we will see folks continue, Black and brown folks continue to be arrested at higher rates. And so we have to have this conversation about how at the individual, institutional, and systemic level that we can root out these causes of racism and how they persist in everyday life and in our policies and programs. But I would encourage young people, young activists, young advocates, when you recognize, when you feel something in your gut that just doesn't feel right, if you feel as though you're being called into a particular space for reform or advocacy, and if an opportunity presents itself, or if you have the opportunity to create an opportunity to join local, state, or federal government and be a part of the change that you'd like to see, don't run away from those opportunities. I think that these institutions, I've learned, are largely just the people who work for them and who manage them. And to the extent that we can pull more people into government that recognize the harms that government can work proactively to ensure that we identify disparities, we identify inequities, and are committed to establishing policies and programs that target those inequities directly, we will be in a much better position in the future.
Yeah, right. And so in Los Angeles, before the George Floyd protests, we were going to see 100 new dispensaries from social equity applicants. And the policy changes that Kat was able to push through with her team after the protests means that now we're going to see 200 dispensaries from social equity applicants. However, just a status check, there's still about 1,000 dispensaries total in Los Angeles. Currently, only about 185 of those are legal. So we're talking about maybe 1 in 5 storefront marijuana stores in Los Angeles are legal. The rest are not. Kat, when will more become legal?
Yeah, so the city of Los Angeles, when it passed its policy back in the summer of last year, it increased the number of retail licenses that would be made available to social equity applicants, as you mentioned, from 100 to 200 applicants. In December of last year, the department finalized its process of identifying who those 200 applicants are, and those applicants are moving through what we call locally the temporary approval process, which requires them to get licenses from the state, pass inspections locally. They may have to go through an inspection with the fire department and the Department of Building and Safety. But those businesses are progressing through the temporary approval process. And I'm hopeful that by the summer, at least 50 of those businesses would become operational. But because each business is kind of moving at its own pace, depending on the quality of the application that they're submitting, whether or not they need to go through maybe like a business relocation, progressing through the inspection process, the state licensing process. It's difficult for me to specify a specific timeline, but based on what I'm seeing, I'm imagining that at least a quarter of those businesses who participated in what we call phase 3 retail round 1 will be able to receive authorization in the next several months. As you mentioned, there are still many businesses in the city of Los Angeles that are not licensed. Businesses that are not licensed by the city of Los Angeles are illegal, both at the local and state level. And I would encourage consumers to make sure that they are purchasing from licensed operators rather than unlicensed operators. Licensed operators are required to follow certain public health and safety standards to make sure that the cannabis that you're purchasing is what it claims to be and doesn't have things like unsafe levels of pesticides or heavy metals, etc. But we do have we still have a large unlicensed market in the city of Los Angeles, and we're working on various strategies across different city agencies to develop and administer a new enforcement strategy that seeks to rid ourselves of some of those old criminal enforcement tools, because what we've seen is that they just continue to replicate harm and they don't actually do anything to decrease the size of the unlicensed market.
Right. Whereas now we're seeing a lot of raids from LAPD and an aggressive policy on behalf of the city attorney's office, especially arresting low-level workers at cannabis dispensaries who maybe are not even aware they're working for an illicit business.
We have a long ways to go here in the city of Los Angeles. We're just getting started, and we're committed to making sure that our licensing, social equity programs, enforcement efforts, that we continue to move in a direction where we're being more responsible and more equitable. Consumers have a role to play in choosing to buy from legal operators and also those that are equity owned. Regulators and governments have a huge role to play in creating a framework that allows folks to do just that.
Kat, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Amanda. Always enjoy speaking with you.